The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. These words penned by Robert Frost in his poem Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening reveals one of the most profound truths of humankind. Life has its promises to keep and its miles to go before we sleep. This poem depicts Frost riding in a horse-drawn sleigh on a snowy day, and he stops to watch the snow fall against the backdrop of the woods. He doesn't stop long, but inside of him the deep dark woods beckon. But Frost remembers that he has promises to keep and miles to go. He cannot ignore those commitments, those obligations, those promises, so he moves on. We too know the feeling. We pass by a many a dream, a many a good fishing hole, a many a wonderful shopping mall, all because they are promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. We have passed up some lovely and deep and dark woods because they were promises to keep. Parents sacrificed greatly and passed by the lovely, deep and dark woods for their promises to keep to our families, our children and our grandchildren. Soldiers have marched by lovely, dark and deep woods because they are promises to keep for our country and indeed the welfare of the world. Young people in college must move beyond the lovely, deep and dark woods because there are promises to keep for their own future and the future of the world. Newlyweds have to pass by the lovely and dark and deep woods because they have promises to keep to each other and miles to go together in life. Lenten season is a reminder that we who are baptized have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep, whether the sleep is tonight or the sleep of death. Promises to keep and miles to go. Lent invites us to identify once again the promises that we pledge to uphold in our baptism. And in our broken humanity, so disillusioned by our sinfulness in spite of our baptism, Lent reminds us once again that we have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep while we're traveling down a path that leads to holiness and devotion and service to God. And if you're like me, and I think you're just as human as I am, I'd prefer to skip Lent. Guilt and shame cause me to want to forget the times that I have forgotten the promises I pledged to keep on God's behalf. I'd like to forget the times that I've lost battles with the adversary, the devil. And if you're like me, I'd prefer to skip Lent and not dredge up all those promises that I failed to keep to myself, my family, my community, and my God. And if you're like me, I don't want to dwell on those long, hard, difficult months to go. But here it is, the first Sunday in Lent. And I come here today to remember my baptism. It took place in Lent. In fact, the first Sunday in March. I was 11 years old. And as the ministers talked with me at that time, he said there are promises that you must keep. There are promises to God, to your neighbor. There's a promise not to lie or cheat or steal. There's a promise to forgive and restore. There's a promise to worship and to recognize God and to keep Jesus in your heart that you may not sin against God. There's the promise to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. and your neighbor as yourself. Oh yeah, the minister mumbled something about it's hard to do God's work, and my work as a Christian will never be over. Sounds like he was saying there was miles to go before one sleeps. And he told me to expect temptation in the most unexpected places, and even in the sweetest sounding ways. So you, like me, would probably prefer to avoid Lent, but it's here. And we've got to realize that we need to renew our baptism and to reclaim the promises that we made to keep and to walk the miles we need to walk before we sleep. And you know what? When I was baptized at age 11, the very next day was Monday because I was baptized on Sunday night, and I had already forgotten the promises I made, and I'd already forgotten about the miles to go. You see, Jesus' first temptation was the temptation to turn stones into bread. So I got up on Monday morning bright and early after I had been baptized, and I thought to myself, my face will really shine now. I looked into the mirror in the bathroom, and lo and behold, that zip was redder than ever. No shine there. And so I thought, well, maybe you're supposed to shine from the heart. So I went down to the kitchen and I told my grandmother I was going to help her in the kitchen fixing breakfast. So here I go helping her to fix breakfast, and after a couple of moments my grandmother noticed me. She noticed that my baptism had made a difference, I thought, until she said, "Will you get out of my way?" Walked out on the porch, and there was my old faithful dog curled up, sound asleep. And I thought, well, you know, God's going to look after me. I just got to let that go that was in the kitchen a few minutes ago. God's going to take care of me. And that old dog was sound asleep. And I reached down, and I touched it, and all of a sudden it snored at me, and I jerked back. It never occurred to me that I was saved by my quick reaction, and God had nothing to do with it. So I go to school that day, and I'm thinking, you know, I've been baptized. There's something different about me. And I wonder how long it would take people to see that there's something different about me. By morning recess, no one had said a word. They didn't notice anything different about me. By lunchtime, no comment. By the afternoon recess, the thought come to me, you're going to have to help these people figure out that you're different. It never occurred to me that that was the devil speaking. So, I remembered this kid that put chewing gum on the back of his desk. And so I said to him, God wouldn't like what you've done. And he said, what have I done? And I told him. And you know what he said? Will you mind your own business? It didn't take me 40 days to be faced with all three temptations. In fact, it didn't even take 40 hours. You see, temptation comes. And in all these things I shared with you, it was a misunderstanding of the promises to keep and the miles to go ahead of me. You see, of Jesus' three temptations, the first temptation was to do good for selfish reasons. And so I helped in the kitchen for the selfish reason of getting noticed. The second temptation was to do foolish things because God's going to look after you. And I found out that my dog doesn't like foolish things. Jesus' third temptation was literally to straighten up the rest of the world and get people to bow down. And I found out that that doesn't work either. I found out that in my selfishness I had lost sight of the promises to keep and the miles to go before I sleep. And you and I have made promises in our baptism. Promises to keep. And we need to keep them. We need to walk the long miles that we have to go. Not only before we sleep tonight, but before we sleep for eternity. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. This Lent, we are challenged to quit turning stones into bread. Well, how do we turn stones into bread? I can remember the times as a parent I cut short the time that I grounded one of the boys. Not because I was unreasonably hard, but because I needed them to like me, turning stones into bread. I have bought things for myself at the store and things for my family that were way too expensive because I wanted to please them and myself. Stones into bread. Yes, I've even sugar-coated a few sermons here and there because I like my people and I wanted them to like me. But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. The promises that I made at baptism of service, to love God and neighbor, not to please you or myself. This Lent, we are challenged to quit leaving it all up to God. At baptism, I did make a promise to be God's hands and feet, to be God's voice and ears. And oh, by the way, at baptism, God did not promise to protect us from foolish choices that we jumped into without thinking. God didn't promise to cut short the length of the time that a teenager has to wait to get their driver's license. And God does not promise to swoop down and rescue you or me when we put our foot in our mouths or do something outrageous.